Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 15 of my Witchwood card review. Guys, we're nearing the end, thankfully, finally. This time around, I have an absolutely ridiculous legendary, a handful of other cards. As always, if you don't have a lot of time, you can hit the quick reviews link in the description. Otherwise, let's go ahead and jump into my detailed reviews. So first here, let's talk about that new legendary. This is Countess Ashmore, a new neutral legendary, 7 mana, 6/6, with a battle cry that reads, draw a Rush, Lifesteal, and Death Rattle card from your deck. So obviously the comparison here might be something like the Curator 2.0, another 7 mana card that drew you 3 specific kinds of things from your deck. Countess Ashmore does not have Taunt, but she does have an additional 2 attack. Solid body here for a 7 mana minion. And I would argue that the minions are, in fact, just cards. They're not even just minions. Lifesteal and Death Rattle can be weapons and other things too. But regardless, the cards she draws, I think, are more powerful and more interesting as keywords than just the tribal sorts of cards that the Curator drew. Essentially, you can get really big, awesome stuff and guarantee, like, it's fine to run one Death Rattle minion. It's not always okay to run one Murloc. Like, not every deck just wants to squeeze in a Murloc. So Curator didn't fit perfectly for every class, but often you can squeeze in one Death Rattle. You can squeeze in one Lifesteal card. Maybe you can squeeze in a Rush card too, just to ensure that a card like Countess Ashmore draws you a big old pile of a lot of valuable stuff. And obviously, a 7 mana 6/6 that draws 3 cards is amazing. That's incredible. That's a ton of card draw. If you compare it to something like Ancient of Lore, the old Druid card, that was a 7 mana 5/5 that used to draw you 2 cards. They nerfed it, now it only draws you 1. But it used to draw you 2, and that was played in every Druid deck, and it was a ridiculous turn 7 play. You always felt good drawing 2 cards off your Ancient of Lore. Countess Ashmore does that. She has additional stats. She draws you specific things, so you can include exactly what you need in your deck and pull it out with a ton of specificity and reliability thanks to Countess Ashmore. So it's like she's way better than Ancient of Lore, and that card was so good that it got nerfed. Frankly, even if you don't, for instance, have a Lifesteal minion that you care about or a Rush minion that you care about, just running this for 2 card draws is still a fantastic play in a mid-range or control kind of deck. So even though it might feel a little bit restricted, it's like, man, I don't have a Rush I want to run, or there aren't really any good Lifesteal cards for my deck or my class, doesn't matter. Just run that Death Rattle in the other one. You're fine. Frankly, maybe even just her drawing a Death Rattle wouldn't be that terrible in some decks. So clearly there are a handful of classes that are going to benefit from this right away. If you think about like Warrior, who has a big set of Rush cards in Rush synergy pieces, Countess Ashmore looks like she's going to make a ton of sense. Lifesteal is clearly a keyword that is in a couple different classes. Things like Warlock right now could really utilize the Lifesteal aspect. Even a card like the Spellstone has Lifesteal, so spells could be drawn as well. And then Death Rattles, of course, everybody can run a Death Rattle here or there. So like Warlock and Warrior stand out the most. But if you think about it, you could probably find a trio of cards in any given class, almost any given deck, that would fit okay with Countess Ashmore. And because she's so good, because she allows you to refill your hand so quickly, it'd probably be worth making a small sacrifice here or there for a slightly less optimal card just to empower that Countess Ashmore turn, just to refill your hand. Now, aggro decks maybe would get less return on their investment from Countess Ashmore, but certainly any sort of mid-range deck or control deck that could refill their hand while playing a big body like this is going to absolutely love this card. So I think Countess Ashmore is fantastic. There's almost no downside here. The fact that she doesn't have Taunt compared to Curator, I guess, is a tiny little issue that could be a problem, because Curator did basically give you a little extra time to utilize those cards because you knew it was at least providing a small minimal defense against aggro decks, which Countess Ashmore won't do. Sometimes it might feel risky to play her if you're playing against a super fast deck. So I guess that's her only tiny downside, but I think despite that, she's just so strong, does such an awesome, big, specific thing, tutoring out cards from your deck. That's so valuable, and so many different kinds of classes would want to run that. Could even set up cool combos and all kinds of different things too in the future. We don't know. These keywords aren't going away anytime soon. So this is the card that's only going to get better over time, and frankly is already fantastic. So, spoiler alert, this is an easy 5-star card for me. I think it's the best legendary we've seen yet in the Witchwood, and it will be a staple for at least a couple decks and a handful of classes. Countess Ashmore is awesome. So now let's talk about a new Shaman card. This is the Totem Cruncher. And he sure is a cute little guy. He's like a porcupine and a rabbit and, I don't know, some kind of alien. But this is a 4-mana 2/3 beast. He has Taunt by default. He also has a battle cry that reads, destroy your totems and gain +2/+2 for each totem destroyed. So, for instance, if you destroy one totem here, you've got a 4/5 taunt. 2 totems would give you a 6/7 taunt. You can get up to an 8/9 taunt if you destroy even more, and so on and so forth. And that's a really big minion, right? 6/7 taunt is awesome for 4 mana. That would be amazing. That's way overstated and a really defensive sort of play. It's better than a 4 mana 7/7 without taunt, particularly when it doesn't have overload. But it's not that simple, of course, right? Totem Cruncher, yeah, sure, the upside is there. If it works out perfectly, you'd be happy to get a taunted Boulder Fist Ogre for 4 mana. Perfect. But of course, it's not free. You're making sacrifices. You are killing your totems in the process to accomplish that. Which means, essentially, it kind of does have overload in a way, if you think about it. But it's almost a reverse overload. In other words, you're sacrificing mana that you spent previously in order to benefit your Totem Cruncher now. It's basically the opposite of overload. So you spent 2 mana on that totem, now you're destroying that totem, and you're losing essentially 2 health, and you're losing, or 2 stats, I should say, and you're losing some sort of effect on the board in order to gain +2/+2 onto the Totem Cruncher minion. Now, yes, in a vacuum, a totem is probably worse than stats on a taunted minion, because this forces your opponent to react to it. It's a big body, it can take trades, it has attack unlike some totems. So yeah, in a vacuum, that's fine. But, of course, if you think about a card like Totem Cruncher, who's going to want to run this? Does a control deck want to run this? Does a control deck want to sacrifice their healing totem and their spell damage totem? When those offer something on the board, you're sacrificing another small taunt that could get in the way. I'm not sure it's that simple. Plus, of course, if you run things like Manatide Totem, Flame Tongue Totem, Primal Fin Totem, those totems have real onboard value. They're awesome. You spent mana and a card on those. You don't want to kill those with Totem Cruncher. You don't want to kill Nightmare Amalgam with Totem Cruncher. So in any sort of totem deck or totem synergy deck, I feel like it's such a big downside to want to kill your totems. That's just not a play you like to make. Now, traditionally, Shaman has been a wide board deck. They like to have multiple smaller minions to leverage things like Flame Tongue Totem and Bloodlust and other cards, all the Evolve stuff in the past as well. Now, clearly Evolve is rotating out. But still, the core of Shaman is building a wide board of stuff, sort of a token style, and leveraging that. Totem Cruncher, though, it kind of leverages that in a way, because, of course, you are turning those wide boards into a bunch of stats, but simultaneously you sacrifice all those other synergies that Shaman has. So this almost goes counter in a way to the primary way we've seen Shaman played historically. And frankly, if you're going to do something like that, where you leverage all those totems into a big minion, why wouldn't you just run a card like Frostwolf Warlord instead of Totem Cruncher? It kind of does the same thing. It turns into this giant minion. It's about the same cost at 5 versus 4. Sure, it doesn't have taunt, but you get to keep all your totems. And Frostwolf Warlord is obviously not a card that sees competitive constructed Hearthstone play, so I'm not sure why Totem Cruncher would either. It's just, there's such a sacrifice here. There's such a big trade-off. And if you think about this like in an aggro deck where you're trying to get a really big minion out on turn 4, it's like, do you totem on turn 2 and totem on turn 3? That's not what an aggro deck is looking to do. Same time, if you look at it in a control deck, you're sacrificing the utility of those totems, and you're still just putting all of your eggs in one basket, essentially, with Totem Cruncher, which makes it really susceptible to removal and silence and all that stuff. So in both environments, I don't really see how Totem Cruncher thrives. It's just the cost is too high. The benefit is there theoretically, but the cost is too high. And then if you just look at like a blank board turn 6 sort of play, where you hit your hero power and then you play Totem Cruncher, that's a 6 mana 4/5 taunt. That's not good either. So there's a lot of conditionality here with Totem Cruncher where you have to have the right sort of board to make this good, and that's just really hard to pull off. Now, all of that said, I do think there's one place Totem Cruncher could work. One place. Somebody's already left a hateful comment like, Regis, you didn't talk about this. But I am about to talk about it, so you should have watched the whole video. I'm going to make fun of you in the comments. Totem Cruncher might be decent in a Gin Greymane kind of deck. Gin Greymane, of course, an even cost synergy card that makes your hero power cost 1. And suddenly, if you can totem for 1, the +2/+2 buff here to Totem Cruncher makes a lot more sense. You're sacrificing less tempo, You're sacrificing less onboard value in order to buff your Totem Cruncher, and then it looks a little more reasonable, right? Essentially, a 1 mana +2/+2 makes a lot more sense than a 2 mana +2/+2. So for instance, a 5 mana 4/5 with Taunt feels a little better, and occasionally you might get a couple extra totems lingering in there too. Then you have a 5 mana 6/7 with Taunt, and that feels really good. So, not to mention, of course, that again, Greymane deck might just be lacking cards. Shaman has a lot of good stuff at the odd cost. So, filling in some of the gaps, we also got that Merc Spark Eel for Shaman, which is an even cost, boost card essentially for Gin Greymane decks. Maybe, just maybe, Totem Cruncher does see a little bit of play in that Gin Greymane environment. Now, of course, Gin Greymane would have to work, has to be worth it. Not sure that's going to be the case. There may not be a Gin Greymane Shaman deck, but that's the one hope for Totem Cruncher here, the one place it could potentially thrive. At a base level, though, with 2 mana totems, with all the other good totems in the pool, the sacrifice is just too great. Totem Cruncher has way too big of a trade-off to make it any good, so normally pretty bad. In Gin Greymane, maybe just okay. So up next, let's talk about a new mage spell. This is the Book of Specters. A 2 mana spell. It reads, draw 3 cards. Whoa, that's a lot of cards for 2 mana. But also discard any spells drawn. Wow, that's crazy. Discard and mage. This feels like a warlock spell almost, right? But somehow it's a mage card, which is pretty cool. So, obviously, drawing 3 cards for 2 mana is stupendously awesome. That is amazing. Arcane Intellect is a great card that's 3 mana that draws you 2 cards. So, clearly, if you don't draw any spells here, Book of Specters is absolutely stellar. Fantastic. Amazing. The downside, obviously, Mage loves spells. Mage has awesome spells. Mage is a spell-driven class, first and foremost. There's only been maybe a couple Mage decks ever in history that I could think about that were more minion-driven. Now, of course, they have minions in them always, like Secret Mage does, but a lot of secrets, too. The one that really stands out, I guess, was Mech Mage in the past, and sure, maybe this gets a inclusion in Mech Mage right away in Wild format. Who knows? That could be possible. But in Standard format right now, Mage is far more spell-driven. Secret Mage has all the secrets and damage spells. Big Spell Mage, Control Mage has all those big spells, right? It's in the name in both cases. So clearly a challenge to figure out what kind of deck wants to run a card like Book of Specters. A minion-based mage is not something we understand right now. But there are opportunities. Things like Elemental Mage has been sort of a fringe competitive deck, right on the verge of being good, like a tier 4 kind of deck for a while. So Book of Specters could possibly empower an Elemental Mage deck to refill their hand and draw more stuff and keep up the pressure. That's one potential play for Book of Specters. Of course, always in the future, an Aggro Mage could show up that's more of a Zoo style or something that Book of Specters empowers, makes up for the lack of the card draw that Warlock has built in with their hero power. So that's always a line that's a possibility. And frankly, even if Book of Specters fails some of the time, like even if you only get 1 minion and you discard a couple spells, or frankly drawing 2 cards and discarding a spell, that's probably still good on average. Most of the time, if you build your deck correctly, you'd get at least 2 cards out of this, and a 2 mana spell that draws 2 cards is still amazing. So sacrificing 1 card occasionally probably wouldn't be all that bad in the scheme of things. So it's not like you'd have to build a completely all minion-based deck. Obviously, you'd probably run 2 copies of Book of Specters, so there's always the chance you could draw your other Book of Specters and discard it. But even just a deck that's, 20 minions and 10 spells is going to give you a solid rate of return on Book of Specters a vast majority of the time, and it would still be worth it. And discarding cards at the end of the day is not that big of a deal unless, of course, you go to Fatigue, and I'm assuming a deck that runs this would never be looking to go to Fatigue because it's going to be pretty focused on card draw. So I do actually think this might be playable. Now, as we understand Mage today, it's probably not going to make the cut right away, but somewhere down the line, if some deck shows up that's minion-based, if Elemental Mage becomes good enough, Book of Specters is exactly the sort of card that has a power level that's high enough to empower that as a draw engine. So I don't think this card's good right away, but it certainly has a lot of potential. It has some raw strength. It's really interesting design. I have a lot of hope for Book of Specters. Up next here, let's talk about a new warrior card. This is the Festeroot Hulk, a new 5 mana 2/7 that reads, after a friendly minion attacks, gain +1 attack. So first things first, clearly a 2/7 is not that great for 5 mana, particularly because this minion is all about its stats. It doesn't have any other effect to empower it, it's just a giant minion. And a giant minion that can escalate its attack, but that's still just a stat play. So for this thing to make sense, it has to have really compelling stats. And 2 attack for 5 mana is just not enough. That doesn't trade into very many things. Moving into the mid game, yes, it could theoretically clear smaller boards from your opponent, but it doesn't have taunt or anything, so no reason for them to attack into it. It would take forever for it to get any sort of value as a Totem Cruncher style of minion. But, of course, it can gain attack, and I think it starts to be an okay minion as it gets to like 4 attack. A 5 mana 4/7 would be reasonably statted, sort of the vanilla stat line. As it climbs to 6 and 7 attack, that's where it maybe becomes good. You wouldn't mind paying 5 mana for a 6/7. That would be obviously above vanilla, but it has to be good to be played in Hearthstone these days. Remember, we're not comparing it to Boulder Fist Ogre. Boulder Fist Ogre is not good enough. So it would have to be that Boulder Fist Ogre stat line at a discount. As it gets to 7, 8 attack, that's where it becomes really exciting, I think. That's a pretty high pressure minion for 5 attack. That's that 4 mana 7/7 range, right? Becomes bigger than a 4 mana 7/7. So I think you got to have that 8/7 to compare it to anything like Bittertide Hydra, Fell Reaver, those sort of cards in the past. That's where it makes sense. Get it to 8 attack. But of course, it's really, really hard to get this thing to 8 attack. It's going to take forever. There are basically 2 routes to buff this thing. One is you have a giant board of stuff when you play it, and then you attack with all of that stuff and buff it instantly. The other scenario is where you play it and hope to buff it over time by both attacking with itself, but with also other cards, particularly probably rush cards, or the thought when designing this is that if all of your minions have rush and can attack instantly, it's going to be easier to boost up your Festeroot Hulk. But even then, you know, most of the rush cards we've seen are more mid-range cards. They're 4 mana, 5 mana, etc. So it's like you're only going to maybe get 1 or 2 extra attacks from rush per turn on Festeroot Hulk. So it's going to take like at least 1 turn to get it to 4 attack. It takes 2 turns to get it to 6 attack. 3 turns to get it to the point where I said it was actually a compellingly statted minion. So it's just going to take forever to get any sort of return on Festeroot Hulk, and it's not going to be doing much in the meantime. It's going to be trading and dying with its lower attack value. So by the time you get it up there, it's going to have like 1 or 2 health or 0 health because it died forever ago. And in the scenario where you already had 5 or 6 minions, is this the best follow-up? I don't think so. There's better ways to probably just win the game, because if you somehow stabilize 4 or 5 minions on the board early as a warrior, that means you're way ahead and you're just looking for damage and looking for pressure, and Festeroot Hulk is probably not a fitting follow-up in that scenario. You might just be better off with that Bittertide Hydra still. So to me, this thing seems like it has a lot of issues with speed and getting its job done, like becoming a nicely statted minion is just going to take way too long. Frankly, when I compare this to something like Gurubashi Berserker, I feel like Gurubashi Berserker is still a better card for Warrior with the exact same stat line and cost, because Warrior's so good with Whirlwind effects, and they got all these new Whirlwind effects. So that seems like almost a better version of Festeroot Hulk, frankly, and that's not a very good card. Also, you could almost compare this to Frothing Berserker in a way as well, a minion that gains attack, that comes down way earlier, and frankly has more potential to gain more attack much faster, therefore being a much better aggro minion as well. So I don't really know who wants to play Festeroot Hulk. I don't know how they make it a nicely statted or relevant minion. It seems to me like it's just way too passive and way too slow to ever see any sort of play. So now let's talk about the Mossy Horror, a new neutral minion here. With like, he doesn't look like a horror at all. He's got pretty funny artwork. He reminds me of Monsters, Inc. in particular. This is a 6 mana 2/7. And its battle cry reads, destroy all other minions with 2 or less attack. So this is kind of the big brother of the Stampeding Kodo, minion that destroys a single enemy minion with 2 attack. Now, Mossy Horror does have the downside that it can kill your own stuff, but I don't really think that's much of a downside for this style of card, because the kind of people that would want to run this would be essentially control decks that are looking to stomp out a wide board from their opponent of tiny stuff, and typically when you're doing that, either your board is empty, or you have slightly bigger minions yourself, or you build your deck in a way where you're not really risking killing your own things. So Mossy Horror would be fine in that regard. The fact that it's a symmetrical effect is really a very, very, very tiny downside outside of except perhaps Arena, where it could be a downside. But in Constructed, it's no problem at all. And of course, destroying all that stuff is great. That's essentially Shadow Word Horror. a card that does see play in Priest pretty regularly, particularly in big Priest, but also just any kind of control Priest throughout the last year, has utilized Shadow Word Horror to great success. And Mossy Horror is essentially a neutral Shadow Word Horror on a stick. It's attached to a minion. And if Shadow Word Horror is a 4-mana card, that essentially means you're getting this 2/7 minion for only a kind of 2-mana bonus. And that's really good. A 2/7 for 2 is ridiculous. So at a raw level, a lot of this makes sense. Mossy Horror looks pretty cool. Now, I will say that there are a couple problems with the comparison to Shadow Word Horror. First off, this is a 6-mana card as opposed to a 4-mana card. So it will not be playable against aggro decks nearly as early as something like Shadow Word Horror, which is a big problem. It has to sit in your hand just a little bit longer than you'd like. And it even compared to something like Stampeding Kodo too, that's a big difference as well. Just sitting there a little too long. One turn later could make a really big difference when you're just barely hanging on for life. Secondly, this cannot be combined, at least in standard format any longer, with the card Pint-Sized Potion, which really synergize so perfectly with Shadow Word Horror for Priest because they could kill even mid-sized things. 5 health stuff would still die to that combo. Mossy Horror does not have that available. In Wild format, sure you can with Priest, but in every other class in standard format, it's not possible. So there is a little bit of a reduction in utility for Mossy Horror there as well. Now, despite those problems, I still like this card a lot. I think it offers some very interesting counters to powerful things in the meta right now. For instance, if Druid were to become popular and something like Spreading Plague is in the meta all the time, Mossy Horror is the perfect answer to Spreading Plague. It just kills all of the scarabs that the Druid summons. It's also good against all the leftovers from Void Lords, all those Void Walkers hanging out. It's still pretty good in a Paladin meta where they reload the board after you've killed the first couple attempts and they just play Stand Against Darkness again. Boom, you drop Mossy Horror. Now, I guess Stand Against Darkness is rotating out, so that's not the best comparison. But they still have lots of ways to reload with Vine Cleaver and everything else Lost in the Jungle. And Mossy Horror could help you clean up that second or third time, particularly in decks that perhaps don't have a lot of AoE clears that are a control deck. So Mossy Horror does provide some utility. I think it's the kind of card that could definitely be played. It's a strong neutral card, really powerful effect. Control decks could use this. Not every deck is going to want to. It's not one of those cards. But it does live in that sort of Primordial Drake space where it can be utilized by a variety of different people. Now, the fact that it's not a dragon or any other tribe does hurt it a bit compared to something like Primordial Drake, but it's also cheaper and has a different vector of removal than Primordial Drake. So still, depending on the meta, could find a home. I think Mossy Horror, not the best card in the set by any means, but a strong one that could find play in certain classes and certain control decks. And then finally here I have one last card. It's a neutral epic once again. This is the Splitting Festeroot, an 8-mana 4/4 with a death rattle that reads summon 2/2/2 Splitting Saplings. And although I don't have the artwork here, those 2/2 Splitting Saplings also have a death rattle that reads summon a 1/1. So essentially there are 3 layers of minions here. You have the 4/4 Splitting Festeroot. When it dies, it turns into 2 minions that are both 2/2s, that when they die, they turn into multiple instances of 1/1s. So you start with 1 minion, then you go to 2 minions, and then you go to 4 minions. Now, those final ones do not have death rattles. The 1/1s are the minimum size here, essentially, for the end result. And clearly, that's a lot of stuff. That's a pain to deal with. There's so many different aspects to this minion, and it just keeps going a long, long time. It's like your own N'Zoth in a can. Like, all you need is this 1 minion to empower N'Zoth. You're ready to go. And I guess the total stat allocation there, if we do some math, I guess it's always 4/4 times 3, so you get essentially 12/12 in total stats. Is that right? Probably not, but close enough. And sure, 12/12 for 8 mana is reasonably statted. The problem, of course, is just how darn slow this play is. A 4/4 on turn 8 is just awful. That is so slow. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't trade well. Your opponent could frankly just ignore it and leave it there because it's not a threat around turn 8. It's just terrible. And then, of course, a couple 2/2s also kind of terrible. And the 1/1s, again, pretty terrible. So it takes 3 turns to get the full stat value out of this, which is way too long because your opponent's just going to ignore each iteration of it. It just doesn't make a big enough impact. Like, yes, it's annoying, but that's the best it's ever going to be is annoying. It won't ever be good or strong enough or or hard enough or fast enough. It just doesn't make the game change around it. And that's the problem for splitting Festeroot. Fair bit of value, not really an excessive bit of value, frankly. If it was like a 6/6 that turned into a 3/3 that turned into a 1/1, that would be way less symmetric as far as the math is concerned, but it'd be so much stronger. A 6/6 you could actually afford to play. Multiple 3/3s would be more direct and impactful as well. So, I mean, I guess you could make it an 8/8 and turn it into 4/4s and then 2/2s, but that would be way too good. That might be over the edge in value. So I understand why they landed here from the numbers standpoint, but I think that still just leaves this as a pretty under par or weak constructed format card. Might be okay in Arena, frankly, just because it lingers around for so long and there's a lot of stuff bundled into it, but terrible in constructed format. I mean, I didn't even talk about how susceptible it is to silence, but that's not really a reason in and of itself the card is bad, but it is yet another downside too. So I really don't see this one ever seeing play, even in some sort of Death Rattle synergy deck. Like Quest Priest couldn't use it because it's way too late in the curve to make any sort of sense for Quest Priest, even though there are 3 Death Rattle minions bundled into one. It just takes forever to get there. So once again, just way, way, way too slow. If this was 6 mana, let's talk. But at 8 mana, it's just not going to work. Okay, so that wraps it up for my detailed reviews for each of these cards. Now what I'd like to do is go through and rate each of these from 1 to 5 stars in my quick reviews. Countess Ashmore is a 5-star card. Totem Cruncher is a 2-star card. Book of Specters is a 3-star card. Festeroot Hulk is a 2-star card. Mossy Horror is a 4-star card. Splitting Festeroot is a 1-star card. And there you go, folks. That's it for part 15 of my Witchwood card review. I can't believe we've made it this far. Countess Ashmore is amazing and awesome, and I love it, and I can't wait to play it. But I'm curious what you guys think. What cards were right? What cards were wrong? What is good? What is bad? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I always love to hear your insights on these cards. Tell me why I'm wrong. I want to know. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.